warm welcome to episode 2 of the new policing TV series, Manifesto for Change, Preventing Male Violence in Policing. I'm Nazir Afzal, and I was the Chief Crown Prosecutor for the Northwest of England, and subsequently the Chief Executive of the country's Police and Crime Commissioners. And more recently, I've been involved in a number of portfolio roles, including National Advisor on Gender-Based Violence to the Welsh Government, Chair of Safeguarding at the Catholic Church, and other roles that I won't bore you with. And I'm going to be your chair for this session. This is the second in a series of episodes exploring prevention or management of male violence within policing. And we'll be drawing on a range of expert evidence from inside and outside of policing to engage in this informed debate. Throughout 2021, the policing of violence against women and girls has come under significant scrutiny. There is acknowledgement that police forces are consistently failing to protect women and girls from sexual and violent crime, and from violence even at the hands of police officers and staff. Many have compared, for example, the kidnap, rape and murder of Sarah Everard as a watershed for policing, in a similar way to the murder of Stephen Lawrence. The gap between what the public need from policing and what they get, especially for women, people of colour and from marginalised communities, has grown significantly. Trust, confidence and legitimacy for many in policing is broken. Within this context, the intention of each episode is to explore how policing actually works so we can better understand why it goes wrong and whether there are solutions that can address systemic failings. Our aim is to include recommendations and create radical and, we hope, deliverable interventions through open discussion and debate. In this panel, we're going to be discussing prevention, not management, exploring is the system letting down women and girls, with a focus, we hope, on high-level strategic solutions and a fundamental shift to a preventative approach. I'm delighted to be joined by an extraordinary panel of experts for this episode. I'll now introduce each one of them in turn. Firstly, we have Nicole Jacobs. Since her appointment to the role of designate, or now Domestic Abuse Commissioner, not designate anymore, for England and Wales, Nicole has been energetically putting her 20+ years of experience in domestic abuse policy and intervention to work, driving improvements, we hope, to transform the response to domestic abuse in England and Wales. She's committed to championing victims and survivors of all ages, status and backgrounds, and to shining a light on practices that fail them. Nicole began her career at the Alabama State Coalition Against Domestic Violence in the United States of America. In 1999, she came to London as an early worker at Advance, one of the first advocacy, now DVA services in the UK. In 2000, she began working at Standing Together Against Domestic Violence, expanding the coordinated community response efforts into health settings, before becoming CEO of Standing Together in 2013. She held a number of senior leadership positions at highly respected organisations, including Special Project Director at Safe Lives and Senior Operations Manager at Refuge. Our second panellist is Paddy Tipping. Paddy was the first Police and Crime Commissioner for Nottinghamshire from 2012 to 2021. As well as his work locally, he held a number of national positions, including becoming chair of the Association of Police and Crime Commissioners and a member of the National Policing Board. Prior to this, he was the Member of Parliament for Sherwood. Yes, that's the place where Robin Hood was, from 1992 to 2010. He was a minister appointed by Tony Blair, during which time he was also the Minister for the Millennium Bug. He is currently involved in a number of roles in the health sector, drawing on his long experience in social and community work. Our next panelist is Mandu Reid. In April 2019, Mandu became the first person of colour to lead a national political party in British history when she took the helm of the Women's Equality Party. Prior to that, she spent 12 years working at City Hall for all 3 mayors of London. In 2015, she founded the Cup Effect, a charitable social enterprise, advocacy and campaigning organisation that tackles period poverty in the UK and globally. In 2019, she was recognised by Apolitical as one of the top 100 most influential people in global gender policy, alongside people like Michelle Obama, Belinda Gates, and Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Following a successful general election campaign later that year, which pushed ending violence against women up the political agenda, Mandu is currently leading the party's campaigns in response to how the COVID crisis will make a lasting change for women's equality. Our fourth panelist is Baroness Helena Kennedy QC. She's one of Britain's most distinguished lawyers. She has spent her professional life giving voice to those who have the least power within the system, championing civil liberties and promoting human rights. She has conducted many prominent cases of terrorism, official secrets, and homicide. She is the founding force behind the establishment of the Bonavero Institute of Human Rights at the University of Oxford. In 1997, she was elevated to the House of Lords, where she's a Labour peer. She's published a number of books, including 2 on how the justice system is failing women, and has written and broadcasted on many issues over the years. Currently, she's taken on the role of director to the International Bar Association's Human Rights Institute. She directs the Institute's work upholding the rule of law and human rights globally. Our final panelist today, and what a panel we've got, is Martin Hewitt. Martin is the chair of the National Police Chiefs Council, the NPCC. He was appointed in April 2019. Martin began his policing career with Kent Police in 1993 and transferred to the Metropolitan Police in 2005. As an assistant commissioner for 5 years, Martin led frontline and local policing, specialist crime and professional standards. He led the national police response to adult sexual offences and kidnap between 2014 and 2019, and served as a vice chair for the NPCC from 2015 before taking on the leadership of that organisation. A very warm welcome to all of you, and thank you all very much for taking the time to join us today. And so we'll begin, if we will, focusing on the key areas outlined in the title of this episode: prevention, not management, of male violence against women and girls within policing, exploring if the system is letting down women and girls. With it, I hope, focusing on high-level strategic solutions, ensuring that, well, that we actually tackle and eliminate violence against women and girls rather than simply respond as we've always done in the past. Can I ask Nicole to share, if she will, her initial thoughts on this particular subject?
Great, thank you very much. I'm really honored to be here, and I can't wait to hear from my fellow panelists. I'm going to try to focus a few of my comments on things that perhaps maybe will be especially a focus of mine as the Domestic Abuse Commissioner and how it contributes to prevention. I fully anticipate other panelists will make some really excellent thought-provoking points. I suppose one of the things that I always find greatly frustrating when we talk about prevention, because of course prevention will be in every strategy at the local level and the national level, the ambition is shared, and more we're talking about. In fact, my last event this morning was the Association of Police and Crime Commissioners, and it was a focus on public health approaches to violence against women and girls. And I think, there's a growing understanding that clearly we have to talk beyond a criminal justice response. And I mean, I feel like that's been some of my work for years and years now, although obviously we want a criminal justice response to be as effective as possible, and there's a lot of improvements needed there. But if we put that to one side, we all recognize the need for prevention, but we have some really clear obstacles in our way, in my mind, to getting there, and they're not insurmountable, but I think we have to talk about them head on in this discussion. And we often think of a crisis response as a policing response or a criminal justice response. In my mind, I'm also thinking about a crisis response as in the domestic abuse services that are commissioned to kind of offer services at that point. So some of the time we talk about roles such as independent domestic violence advisors. I was one of them. I've worked in many settings in and alongside IDVA roles. They're very crisis oriented, and meaning that they're commissioned for quote unquote high risk domestic abuse and for relatively short periods of time. no one working in those roles wants to necessarily work for a short period of time. It's just the way that they're set up and commissioned, which is part of my point in terms of a major obstacle we have about getting to early intervention or prevention, or some people call that primary or secondary responses, if we're talking about public health response language. And that is that the crisis interventions we have for domestic abuse, thinking about the domestic abuse services that are commissioned, those themselves struggle to survive from year to year. The way they have developed and been commissioned over time, and I've been seeing it up close for the last 20 some years, we have to think back to our first refuges, primarily that we recognize, things like Refuge as an organization. I think Baroness Kennedy and I were at a 50th anniversary event or birthday event or acknowledgement of the refuge in Chiswick in England. I say that because it gives us a perspective. We had our first refuges in and around that time. We've had intervention, the community-based services for domestic abuse building up from that point on, kind of in a very patchwork way, never sitting in core budgets, never sustainably funded, always relying on many funding streams just to keep going for mostly the crisis intervention that they provide. And that means that those are the people who are working day in and day out with survivors of domestic abuse or those subject to domestic abuse, whether or not they're contacting the police or not, providing that safety and support, and yet they struggle to survive year in, year out, and have a very strategic, sustainable funding. Those are the very experts, and those are the very people who bring the voices of victims into our responses and our planned responses for prevention. They bring a lot of expertise, and they're inundated, and they can barely survive in terms of their own service provision. And that is a huge obstacle for us being able to build really effective, comprehensive early intervention and prevention models. Another obstacle is that we invest very little in understanding what works well. So when we think about what does it take to prevent and intervene early, and this is for adults, children, for perpetrators of abuse who need opportunities to change, the provision and our understanding of what works is patchy. So we have some of that established, but we certainly don't invest in a meaningful way to understanding what is the most effective way and what are the most effective interventions that work. We have some opportunities ahead, and I will draw to a close, and I know we just are speaking for a few minutes to start. We have some opportunities ahead to straighten this out. There's a victims bill consultation that asks us about community-based services just this week. And that's one of the things my office is working on. We've been mapping service provision all summer. We have a survey out for victims in England and Wales to tell us directly themselves what kind of services they would like to see in place. We can start to kind of, if we can bed down the crisis part of our system, we can have much more ambition towards prevention and early intervention. We also have strategies from government. We're still waiting for the publishing of the domestic abuse statutory guidance, which should give us much better indication of what other organizations or what services should be doing, which will help us build better practice for prevention and early intervention. We have a domestic abuse strategy that should be published, I would hope, in March at the very least. And we have the serious violence prevention duty, which has just allowed or given a greater definition to domestic abuse and sexual violence as part of serious violence. So as that duty comes into effect and partners come together to prevent and work together to prevent serious violence, we have real abilities and levers to do that, as well as some of the work initiated this year from the Youth Endowment Foundation. So there's some promising levers ahead of us. We have to be very, very careful about making sure that we don't use these levers to kind of over police or centralize the police in in the fears that people rightfully have about over policing within particular communities, Black and minoritized communities. But at the same time, we have some ability to make, I think, a genuine shift into prevention with some of these efforts. I'll draw to a close there and allow others to comment, but thank you very much again.
No, thank you, Nicole. I mean, all of that is extremely useful. Obviously, we'll have plenty of time to unpick some of that and to highlight some of it. Can I ask Paddy now? Paddy, yeah, absolutely, the floor is yours, but I want to just mention the fact that Nottinghamshire Police, where you were the PCC, was the first police force in the country to flag up misogyny, for example, as a trigger for crime. And I think Martin will correct me later, but I think there are 13 forces now that do that. But obviously, why did you do that? Why was it important? And what have we learned from that? I think I'd love to hear that, but obviously the floor is yours.
It is important, Nazir, and that's why I'm going to talk about it. And let me just say that if we're going to prevent domestic violence, what we've got to do is work hard to change the attitude of men towards women. And that's why misogyny as a hate crime has really been important, both here in Nottinghamshire and increasing nationally. Started in 2015, community-led, women getting together around the Women's Centre, talking about some of the behaviour, unacceptable behaviour they faced in public spaces. And we spent a lot of time talking and working with them, involving Nottinghamshire Police, involving both universities, and ultimately, as a result of that discussion, Sue Fish, when she became the Chief Constable, began to record misogyny, hate crime on the record. And the campaign has gone on and moved on from them. I mean, I've always been very clear about this, that large numbers of men are not going to go to court. What I have been clear about is that we've got to change the atmosphere and the climate and the way that people behave, sometimes in the most irresponsible way towards women. So we started here in Nottinghamshire in 2016. As you say, a number of other forces have moved forward around misogyny, or another approach is gender-based hate crime. And the campaign has been to get the pilots rolled out nationally. And it's been hard work, but the tide's behind us. I think we are making progress, and I think ultimately we'll get there. I mean, Martin may want to comment when he talks about the attitude of some chief constables. In the early days, there were a number of chief constables who thought this was a diversion, who thought that this wasn't real policing, who thought that they would be overwhelmed by demand, and were, to put it bluntly, quite sceptical about it. And some of those were senior police leaders. I think the attitude's changed. You talked earlier on about Stephen Lawrence and the Macpherson inquiry, a seminal moment. I think we need to use Sarah Everard's murder as another point for change. And it just seems to me that this gives us the opportunity for change and to make a difference. And I'm clear in my own mind that this is a step-ladder approach, that casual report comments and will lead to more serious crimes in the end. And I'm very cognizant of the fact that we need to tackle people's, young men particular, behaviour. And what women say to me in Nottingham and Nottinghamshire is, we don't want a lot of people going to court, but we want you to be on our side. We want you to be clear that this is unacceptable behaviour. We want you to back us, and we do. And again, as part of the work, 97% of women we talked to during this process had experienced some kind of sexual advance or unwarranted advance. So it's a big issue, and we've got to move it forward. Where we're at the moment is that there are discussions in Parliament and with the Law Commission around adopting misogyny as a hate crime. I think the Law Commission report was disappointing, but it did take us some steps forward. The present crime, policing, sentencing and court bill before Parliament at the moment, and Helena will know all about this, was heavily amended in the Lords very recently. And as part of the amendment, misogyny became a hate crime. But I think there's a difference of approach within government. The government's Home Office Laws Minister has promised that she would roll out a scheme across the country. That hasn't happened yet. My impression is that the Home Office would like to do something around this. But my impression, and this is rather ironic given the Prime Minister's present difficulties, was the phrase he used, the police should focus on real crime. Now, what I argue quite clearly is that the casualisation, the irresponsible behaviour of men to women leads to serious crime further on. And I think we're on the cusp, really, of making a difference and making a change. So I've talked a lot about misogyny as a hate crime. I mean, I'd like later on in the session to talk a little bit about some of the work we've been doing in the nighttime economy. Again, a real area of difficulty and complexity. But let's get on with the debate, Nazir.
Thank you so much, Paddy, and thank you very much for raising that issue. Mandu, Women's Equality Party have been holding a fire pretty much to policing across the country in terms of scrutinising performance or improvements or plans and strategies. If I remember rightly, the North Yorkshire Police and Crime Commissioner, for example, made some very inappropriate comments in the aftermath of Sarah Everard's the conviction of her murderer, and you were very, very vociferous and vehement in your stance on that. In fact, so much so when he resigned, you put a candidate up to ensure that violence against women and girls was on the agenda during that election campaign. So over to you, Mandy.
Thank you so much, Nazir. Thank you so much to everyone who's spoken so far. I think it's really important and significant that we're having this conversation, that it comprises people who have lots of different perspectives and experience and background on this issue. I'm not sure that a conversation like this would have happened in the same way 10 years ago or 15 years ago. So let's appreciate that for a moment. But let's not fool ourselves that I feel like we're at base camp and we got a mountain to climb with respect to addressing this issue. You know, preventing and ending male violence against women and girls for good is not going to be achieved by tinkering with broken, dysfunctional systems, publishing reports, or by putting out press releases every time there's a high-profile case. That's not going to solve this. Our starting point, as has already been suggested, in my view, must be to acknowledge that the causes of male violence against women and girls are sexism, misogyny, inequality, and the power asymmetry that exists between men and women across society. An approach that fails to acknowledge and address those things will not turn the tide on this devastating problem. It fundamentally won't. Now, because of the scale, the depth, the breadth, the ubiquitousness of male violence against women and girls, preventing it is and has to be political. There is a political dimension to it because we're talking about seismic change. We're talking about change needed within some of our most established institutions. And given the way our society is currently organized, that means institutions like police services across the country absolutely having a vital role to play. That's not to say that we must obsess about and focus solely on policing, because as has already been said, that doesn't do enough of the create the preventative dynamic that we're really here to discuss and explore. But when we are examining the policing response and the policing contribution to this, our answer mustn't be to reach for old, knee-jerk, headline-grabbing, so-called solutions. I mean, let's face it, more bobbies on the beat will have a modest impact on the 1.6 million cases of domestic abuse experienced by women every single year, or the vast majority of rape that takes place in the home behind closed doors. So policing responses that probably well-intended want to zoom in on surveillance and things like that aren't going to be what gets us out of this problem. They may capture the headlines, but they aren't going to be what allows us to pave the way for a world where women and girls don't have to accept this as the norm. And so how this is framed is important. And I am encouraged, I think it was reported in the Times last November, that the government will now recognize male violence against women and girls as having the same sort of status as terrorism and organized crime. That's a good thing. Not because it means we can just throw more traditional policing solutions at it, but because it means more resources will be unlocked, which can be deployed towards preventative and cultural change. We can have better coordination, better accountability, and better leadership on this. But another thing which I feels really important, I say very clearly, is that we have to have, and it is non-negotiable in my view, that we have to be prepared to acknowledge, address, and have a zero tolerance approach to misogyny and sexism within police service ranks. And notice I use the word police service. I didn't want to use the word police force in this context, because service is the important word here. Serve and protect. That's what police forces are here to do. So if we have a scenario, as we've seen too many examples of, where the culture seems to allow for terrible abuses of power to take place, we ain't never going to solve this problem. We've got to make it reputationally expensive for police officers to exhibit misogynistic attitudes and behaviors, use misogynistic language, etc. There are too many examples. We've seen a flood of them over the last year where it actually seems to be reputationally profitable for police officers to exhibit some of these behaviors. Now, I am not anti-police. My mother was a police officer, a Black woman in her 50s in the Metropolitan Police for 7 years. So I'm not coming at it from that perspective, but I am coming at it from a perspective of the culture within the institutions that are part and parcel of making the changes we need to see. It is going to take leadership. It is going to take facing up to the problem, not being defensive about it, never minimizing it, casting aside bad apple narratives. That ain't going to help us. And so a trauma-informed approach, I know, is starting to gain traction in many areas, but it's not necessarily consistently deployed across the country. Why can't we treat policing these crimes in the way we treat other crimes? You don't start from a place of skepticism when someone reports a burglary. You don't say, why did you have your curtains open so they could see you had a nice flat screen TV? Because of sexism and misogyny, too many women, and Helena's written so much on this, experience that kind of attitude to them reporting crimes. Now, we are here to talk about prevention, and obviously one role the police has in relation to prevention is breaking the cycle of violence, because we know many people are on the many women are on the receiving end of this violence multiple times. And so I want to see us face up to the cultural change needed within this really important institution. I want to see us recognize that we need education, a national program of education. Legislation on its own isn't enough. It doesn't change behavior by itself. It's symbolic and can create deterrence, but we need to change attitudes, behaviors, culture, and norms. And that's why we need a holistic approach that I want to see the government take a lot more seriously, put more money into, and I want to see the police helping us make those calls on the government machinery to make that happen.
Thank you, Mandu. As forceful as I expected. Helena, you've been name-checked several times already. Most recently, you've been carrying out a review for the Scottish Government, and I think you'll share some of what you can share in relation to that, but the floor is yours, Helena.
Thank you so much, Nazir, and it's really an honour to be joining this very distinguished panel. Now, I'm going to come at this because I'm a lawyer, and as a practicing lawyer, it's right as Mandu says, I've written on this for many years. I'm going to shock everybody and tell you that I've been practicing law for 50 years this year. I was called to the bar in 1972. And so most of my life has been involved in monitoring the way in which women experience the criminal justice system and writing about it and seeking reform. A number of you have mentioned that the real challenge is that we haven't managed to do that reform, and we have to ask ourselves why. Why has it been that with all the efforts that have been made to introduce new elements into law, introduce new elements into the investigation and the prosecution of rape cases, that we have the dire circumstance that so few of the actual cases that are brought to the police end up being prosecuted and end up leading to the conviction of perpetrators. The results, speak for themselves. So we've got to look at the fact that it is, here we are talking about something that runs very deep in our society and is about cultural attitudes. And so how do you create cultural change? And there'll be people in the law who would say to you, well, cultural change is about education. It's what happens in the homes. It's what happens in schools. It's what happens as you're developing your understanding of what makes the world tick. And as you go on to further study and go into the workplace, you learn all this stuff as you go along. And we therefore have to address the cultures in all these aspects of a human being's life. And that's true, that's undoubtedly true, but the law does have a role to play. And therefore the institutions of law, whether it's policing, whether it's prosecutorial systems, whether it's the legislature in passing law, whether it's courts and judges and lawyers like myself, it's really important that we all have to sort of really address some of our underlying attitudes that we don't even know we carry in our hearts, and so internalized is this stuff, so socialized into it have we been. And so I do think that, as others have said, we do have to address some of the problems downstream, and that's within the education system and within society's general understandings and the places where you can have an impact. But we also have to have law that signals to society what is acceptable and what's not acceptable, what is therefore lawful and what is not lawful. And I think it is important for us to, if we're talking about misogyny, to really understand what we're talking about here. You see, I know we say we've got to make misogyny a hate crime. Think for a minute. It's the conduct that we're making into we want to be addressed in its criminality. It's not about ways of thinking. We have a very, very important human right, which is freedom of thought. We don't like policing people's thoughts. There's a bit of worry about it now because of the way that algorithms can police thoughts with our use of the internet. And so there's a great new debate about the regulatory role that perhaps the state has to play with regard to the big tech companies. But it's very important that we remember that we don't police thought. Thought must not be policed, even if it's horrible thought. But it's the conduct that flows from the thought that we can police and that we can seek to address through the law. So I personally don't like the saying we're going to make misogyny a hate crime, as though misogyny is becoming a crime, and we don't like it, but it's the conduct that flows from it that we are seeking to address, and so it's what's called an aggravation. There exists in law the potential for having an aggravation around certain kinds of conduct which flow from hatreds, like hatred of homosexuals, hatred of people because of the color of their skin or because of their religion, and so on. We know the list of characteristics that exist. And women quite rightly are saying, hey, well, what about us? And the reason why it's so complicated is because misogyny is so ill understood, because most of us have been brought up and have absorbed ideas of how men should behave and how women should behave and how they should relate to each other. And that is immersed in us from an early age. And we know that little girls And when I'm talking to guys about this, I always talk about the fact that, you know, you only have to have a little girl, and you immediately, when she turns about sort of 9 or 10, you start getting worried about her desire to do things on her own with her friends, to go to places, and as she approaches puberty, that she is going to want more and more freedom as she goes ahead with her life. And from a very early stage, little girls are told, don't do this. Don't go into the park on your own. Always be with your friend. If any stranger talks to you in a way, you've got to tell me about it. And so little girls immediately are made to feel anxious about what it is that they're not supposed to do and how they have to self-safeguard. And that whole process affects the way in which we as women end up living our lives, because women end up feeling anxious about the way in which they conduct themselves. And it's partly because in the lessons that they're told about protecting themselves, they're actually being told that if you don't protect yourself, it'll be your own fault. It'll be you will in some way have contributed to it. If you've stayed out late, if you've come back up a dark street, if you have worn a skirt up to your behind, if you have in some way got yourself drunk or somebody got you drunk, in some way, you are going to end up being blamed for what happens to you, rather than concentrating on the perpetrators of any kind of crime or fear-inducing behaviors that might come your way. So it's about looking at that whole business, because it affects, therefore, the way the distress and the levels of distress and anxiety and fear, and also humiliation sometimes, that can be experienced by women because of how they are treated by men. And one of the things that you know, is always said by the police, and we've heard it mentioned already, is the idea that somehow, listen, we're hard pressed as it is dealing with serious crime or things that are really causing serious harm. We haven't got time to deal with low level stuff. Or as was mentioned, the idea that somehow dealing with low level stuff is not real policing. And yet what we know from all the research that's been done is that actually normalizing low level misogyny towards women and misogynistic conduct towards women is often the precursor to things getting more serious and more grievous kinds of crime. And so it's really important that that link is recognized and accepted by the police. Now, what I wanted to say is that, you know, we're on a learning curve now. And I think it's been so interesting. Sue Fish came and who was the Chief Constable of Nottingham, came and gave evidence, went to the inquiry that I'm conducting in Scotland. And we heard from many women and women's organisations, from members of the Scottish, women in the Scottish Parliament. We heard about the ways in which women's lives are affected by misogynistic conduct. So what is misogyny? And it's why I think it's important for people to understand it. You see, it's quite difficult when you talk about it as being about hate, because in fact it's actually even more complex than that. There are lots of men who, for example, would say to you, I don't hate women, I love women. I love my mother, I love my sister, I love my daughter, I love my wife. They'll tell you and they'll list the ways in which they love women. But it's when they say, you point out to them about things that they've said, they'll often say, well, it's particular kinds of women that I don't like. And it'll be, you know, they don't like feminist women, or they don't like women who are too independent, or women that don't like them, or women that behave in ways that they think are not conforming to their idea of what is an appropriate way of being a woman. And that has to be something that we seek to have men address. You know, the business of, I don't like lesbians, or I don't like, you know, TERFs, or I don't like the whole business of attacking particular kinds of women. In doing so, you're attacking womankind, because women have to be able to be any kind of woman they want to be. That's what equality will mean. And if we're going to live as equal people in societies, then it has to be about an acknowledgement that women will take their opportunities and their way of living as being fundamental to being a fully autonomous human being. And so understanding that it has to be about thinking again about what one's attitudes are and where they might be coming from.
Helena, can we pause there? You have frozen.
We had to find a working group.
Can we pause it? Thank you. We'll come back to you, Helena. No, I appreciate that. Thank you so much. No, you're back now.
Great.
You're back now. I hope you don't mind if we can come back to you on that. I just want to get Martin in. Martin.
Okay, get Martin. But really about,
that.
we really have to understand where misogyny comes from, what it's about, and have proper training within our police services, but also within the legal profession and judiciary and everywhere if we want to address the way in which misogyny affects conduct and the way in which there is a role for criminal law to deal with it.
Thank you so much. Martin. Policing, you're still on mute. Martin, policing's had to deal with a lot of crises over the last, particularly over the last year. We generally pay police to deal with crises. That's their skill set. But this seems bigger than that. This seems like, I think I made the point earlier on that for a lot of people, the events of the last year have really damaged public trust and confidence. And so are the police responding appropriately given the concerns that people have had?
Okay, thanks, Nazir, and it's a real pleasure to be part of this and to be the representative of policing in the discussion. I mean, the answer to that question is a very clear yes. I mean, others have used the word watershed. I think the the murder of Sarah Everard, and particularly at the hands of a serving police officer, and the overwhelming response to that, I think has galvanised the service in a way. These have always been issues that have been dealt with, but I think it's galvanised it in a way that we hadn't seen before. And I guess a big point for me in this discussion is that we must collectively exploit that opportunity and the moment that we have now. It was Nicole talked about, and I think, you know, we're talking about prevention here, and I'll talk in a moment about that has to clearly be much wider than simply policing, but there is a very significant role that policing and other criminal justice partners have to play in this. And I'm sure all of the participants will be aware we have created a national lead around all matters violence against women and girls, Maggie Blythe, who is now in place. We've conducted very significant consultation that led just before Christmas to a plan coming out. And I take the point about plans. This has to be much more than a plan. But if we are going to take this moment, if we are going to lead to sustainable change, we do need to have a plan. And that sits around 3 pillars of activity. The first one gets to the point of your question very clearly, which is about building trust and confidence. And that's about building trust and confidence, not only externally with obviously women and girls, but more generally the public. It's building trust and confidence in all those different groups and individuals that we have been consulting with. And that will only happen if not only in the way that we deal externally with the victimization that takes place, with the reports that are made, but also very, very importantly, as a number of the speakers have already identified, with the issues internally within policing. I don't think there's going to be anyone that's not going to say there is a fundamental issue in society around misogyny and what that turns into, and policing is drawn from society, and we have those issues internally. So a really clear strand of work, and we may come on to talk a bit more detail, is what we need to do internally. The second pillar is around relentlessly pursuing the perpetrator. And again, a couple of the speakers already have kind of alluded to that point. And my way of dealing with this issue is I don't like to talk about violence against women and girls. I prefer to talk about male violence, because I think too often in the discussions, the debate ends up with, as well as Helena just pointed out, with women being essentially told they have to adjust the way they are behaving to fit in with whatever particular circumstance. And we need to be focusing on the perpetrators, on the men that are committing these offences. So it's really focusing in around that. And again, important to say internally within our organisations, within the service, as well as obviously externally and dealing with those individuals there. And then the third pillar is around safer spaces. And of course, we are in this instance talking not only about the private space, we are talking about the public space, and Paddy alluded to that, and we are also talking about the virtual space as well. Because if we look at all the angles with which males are being violent, whether that's physically or mentally or psychologically, that can happen virtually as well. So those are the three pillars. There is that work is being overseen by a group that I've pulled together to make sure that all the various elements of what policing are doing is coordinated, and importantly at this point in time linked with the various reviews, public inquiries, inspections, investigations that are going on, because this is quite a crowded field at the moment. But we've got to use this moment to actually move things forward, and particularly drive consistency, which I think is one of the challenges always, as everyone on this call knows, with policing. But it is really important to say that this cannot be solved, this issue, if we are genuinely talking about prevention, this cannot be solved by policing alone, nor can it be solved by the criminal justice system alone. I absolutely accept there is a fundamental role for policing to play, for CPS to play, for the judiciary and for the court system to play, but we must see this as much broader than that. And that issue of male violence is going to require societal changes if we are going to get to a place where that is better. And various others have described, and Helena just talking there about the growing up, but perhaps another angle from my perspective is I have real concerns about what the identity of being male is at times, and it's how we are bringing up boys into men and how their attitudes are being formed. No one else has mentioned yet, but one of the things that really does exercise me as well is the kind of the availability of pornography to pretty much anyone over the age of 11. 11-year-olds all have a smartphone. Their parents won't send them to school without one, and that kind of availability there, I think, feeding into that process of both boys and girls assimilating. This is how it works. This is how it works between male and female. This is what works. This is how relationships. This is how sex and all those issues and those power dynamics, I think, is a really important issue that clearly is not one that policing can look at. We've talked about, and Nicole particularly, but others have talked about all those other services that need to be in play. Nicole described them as kind of the crisis intervention. If we're talking about prevention, we need to be way ahead of the point where it is a crisis. And I think there's something very clearly that needs to, we pressure, and I pressure in my role, and certainly Maggie in her role, around getting the right funding and investment into those services and organisations that can be part of that preventive exercise, but it has to be evidence-based investment. And I think that's a real challenge for all of us collectively as we look at this problem, is how we identify what really does work and then work to that evidence. And particularly if you look at diverting, stopping the behaviour for male perpetrators, think in the DA space, there are lots of programs that are very, very successful, but they, and evidence-wise, are successful, but either in organisations or politically are seen as less acceptable because they're in some sense in softer. So we really have to work to what the evidence base is telling us that changes the behaviour of men, because ultimately we are talking about male violence here. And then picking up just lastly on that point about misogyny, I have to say I'm kind of in the space that that was just laid out. I think we need to really understand what we mean. The Law Commission, I know Paddy referred to it as well, came back with their perspective on that, and it is working its way through politically. My kind of stance really is, if we're going to put new things onto legislation, they need to be things that are practically going to help and practically make a difference. I do think that point between that difference between thought and conduct is a really challenging one. And I, speaking very practically as a practical police officer, we need to provide clarity to our people on the ground so they understand what they've got to deal with and what the law is expecting of them. So I think that's a debate that will carry on through. But it, for me, sits behind the larger debate, which is the one that how do we collectively, and that's the very broadest we, collectively start to challenge those attitudes, the way that people are developed and grow, and the attitudes that are developed through all of our childhoods that arrive us at the point where people are either believing that behaviours are acceptable, they're not challenging behaviours, and ultimately some people are getting into criminal actions. So that for me is the broad bit, but none of that is to say that there is not clearly a very significant role that policing has to play, and there is a very significant piece of work that we are undertaking to get us into a place where we're doing that better than we have done thus far.
Martin, thank you very much indeed. Main focus of this session is about male violence within policing, and there are obviously other episodes that will deal with the more broader issues. One of the things that struck me in the immediate aftermath of Sarah Everard's murder was this is not a question addressed to you, Martin, this is a question more generally, was that there was, it seemed like a knee-jerk response from policing. It was the, if you don't trust the male officer in front of you, wave down a bus, which I don't know where that came from, but it's become, whether it's an urban myth or not, but I do remember that being publicised. And then I think Police Scotland were the first force to say, if you are not concerned about, if you're concerned about the male officer in front of you, you can speak directly to the control room. How have we got there? How have we got to a situation where, in particular, women, perhaps Mandu can answer this question, particular women are lacking confidence in policing, particularly around male policers? Mandu?
I think it's been cumulative. I think it's a symptom of what I already alluded to around how these attitudes and inequality between men and women permeate society. So why wouldn't it permeate into an institution like the police? But I think the problem is what we've not had is a preparedness to acknowledge how this manifests in police institutions across the country. What I've observed more often than not, and today's conversation is really refreshing. Thank you, Martin, for some of the way you framed this. But what I've observed, this isn't typical. What I've observed is a defensiveness. What I've observed is a closing of ranks. And actually, we talk about Macpherson as a watershed moment. And of course, in many ways it's part of our cultural history now. But today, this is data from the Runnymede Trust. Young Black men in London are still 19 times more likely to be stopped and searched than white men. So we must examine what it really takes to bring about the cultural change in these institutions on whom we are relying. And if we're going to demur from that, if we're going to condone people standing up and talking about wrong uns and bad apples and not getting any rebuke from doing so, we are going to struggle. And I'm glad that Maggie Blythe has been appointed. I hope she's got a budget. I hope she's got a staff team. I hope she has the authority to do the work that makes her appointment really mean something and not be a kind of window dressing type measure. Too often women get put in these positions to kind of sort out issues that relate to sexism and misogyny, but aren't necessarily given the teeth and the authority to do so. So I really hope that's not the case here. But yeah.
Mandy, that's just on that point. Some people might argue, Nicole, that you're the woman that's been put in a position exactly as dear Mandu has just described, a position where you are there now, you have to sort out how domestic abuse is handled. Do you understand those concerns?
Oh, I do. I mean, a really great example is I was actively backing this amendment to the police court, the policing bill that we've referred to, the part of the bill that was about the serious violence prevention duty specifically. And I wanted domestic abuse and sexual violence to be part of the definition, not to be mandated that would have to be adopted, but that it would be really clear that could be considered part of quote unquote serious violence and then subject to that duty. And people who I have worked with for years and years, who I obviously very much respect, said to me, we don't really, we're not as thrilled about this duty as you are, Nicole, because we don't like the idea. It goes back to the trust and confidence thing that Martin talked about as that first pillar that needs to be rebuilt is, you know, we don't want to see in this any distortion of what would be that real coming together and sharing of kind of general population data that would be about preventing serious violence, kind of in the purest sense. What they were saying to me is, we really fear that centering the police in that would potentially lead to exploiting, getting to individual data and over policing of Black and minoritized communities, for example. And so it's almost like they felt it was a bit like playing with fire. And I have to, you know, of course I had to take that on board. I've since had lots of serious discussions with Thames Valley and others about what they've done in order to have an ethical approach to a public health policing response, you know, having panels and external people really looking at the data. So there are ways to do it, but I think this is the other point I wanted to make, which is it may sound idealistic on my part, but the best examples I've seen in my career where we've had really good practice and actual cultural change in the way that people approach policing violence against women and girls is when there's been that real multi-agency kind of genuine work where police have worked alongside domestic abuse experts and advocates and survivors and taken on board. And actually there's a kind of a holding to account of really, you know, the standards of practice we want to see. That is possible, and it does change people's attitudes and it does produce something better. But we tend to think, oh, let's pass a piece of legislation or let's say something, you know, and almost too simplistic. To get it done, you have to really be willing to invest in that coordination, invest in that kind of mutual holding to account. And those are not very easy, popular things to talk about or prioritize, I'm afraid. But I do believe that is where you get the best out of the police, and get not the best out of the police, the best for victims of domestic abuse, really and truly.
Yeah, what struck me actually, well, lots of things struck me in what you were saying, Nicole. But the thing about resourcing, you know, prioritizing. You know, if you prioritize everything, then nothing's a priority. I mean, that's the reality of it. And one of my other roles is I'm trustee of the Association of Safeguarding Partnerships, and you probably appreciate every safeguarding partnership is 3 partners: health, education, and the police. And when I talk to partnerships around the country, some of them anyway, they think it's difficult for police officers or senior police officers to turn up at these events because they're busy doing everything else. And well, I understand that. I totally get that. But you know, you mentioned, and I think Martin was nodding away, you know, the importance of multi-agency working critically in dealing with this kind of thing. But if the police or any other body is not resourced to be able to properly engage and properly do that, well, they're not going to be able to make any difference. Paddy, could I come to you on this? You had as a police and crime commissioner, you had significant convening powers to get people together around a table. What do we do? How do we ensure that everybody gets around the table at the right level so they can make a difference?
So I think Nicole has made some really important points about strong partnership working, sharing resources, sharing platforms, sharing priorities. And it's clear to me that PCCs, together with chiefs, need to use those convening powers to bring people together. I think the other point I'd like to support Nicole on is around identifying and developing good practice. I mean, I've always taken the view that many of the inspection bodies, HMIC, Ofsted, for example, look at failure rather than success. And the notion of developing good public policy is identifying success and promoting it. And Martin made the point that we're all very familiar with. There are 43 different police forces. Getting some commonality across them all is quite important. I think we've made quite a lot of progress, but there's an awful lot more to be done. if you'd allow me, Nazir, I just want to pick up a couple of points that Mandu made, one of which was the police need to acknowledge that there's a problem. And there is a problem, but there is still some denial going on. But there are a whole range of incidents that reflect a bad culture in parts of the police force. And Mandu, you also talked about not needing more officers on the beat to tackle this, and that's right. One of the things that I'm very clear about is that we've got once in a generation opportunity now to change the culture of the police force. Look, 20,000 new officers are being recruited, and by the end of the recruitment process, a third of them will have been in post for less than 5 years. Now that gives us an enormous opportunity to change the culture within police forces. I've just been looking recently about recruitment patterns across the forces in the country. Here in Nottinghamshire, more than 50% of all new recruits are women. And that will bring about change. It's brought about change in Parliament. It'll bring about change in the police force. But one of the things that we've got to be really clear about, and I know Martin's really clear about it because we've just discussed it over the years, that this is a real opportunity to bring change. And given the Sarah Everard difficulties, episode, tragedy, this really is an opportunity that we shouldn't walk away from.
Thank you, Paddy. Helena, I'm going to come to you in a moment, but Martin's got his hand up a little bit, 2 minutes before you. So, Martin.
Sorry. In answer to Mandu's question, Maggie Blythe most definitely does have the infrastructure around her and the support and the position, and working, as I say, directly into the group that I chair and from government, to be fair, to really do what we want doing. So I think that's really an important point to make. You made the point, Nazir, about the some of the responses after the weekend when it became known that Sarah Everard's murderer was a police officer, and I would accept some of those responses, I think, were knee-jerk, but we can all remember that the atmosphere and time has not taken away from me just how shocking it was that was, though that hideous crime, and it was a hideous crime in all its parts, was committed by a serving police officer, and that put a shock through the service. And I met with all the chief constables very shortly after that became known on that Friday. And then, yes, there were some comments that were made that were probably not particularly well advised, but people were responding. But the key point for me is why that first strand of the work that we're doing now is very much about building that trust and confidence. And to go to some of the comments that Nicole made, this is very much working with all those other groups and bodies that have a role to play in here, and particularly having ourselves scrutinised in terms of what we are doing. And there's a bit of work that we're doing, particularly around rape, called Sateria, which has brought groups of academics in to look at not only how do you best do this, but how are you actually doing it, and providing some fairly hard-hitting evidence around where things are not right. And we will carry on working with those groups. So it is very much a collective effort. But I don't think there was any way the service was going to be able to respond sure-footedly after the shock of what we learned on that weekend. But what it has done, it has catalysed all the work that's going on now, and we absolutely need to make the most of that.
Thank you, Martin. Helena.
It's been very interesting listening to people, but I want to take it down. I want to take it down to street level crime. I want to take it down to the experience of women standing at bus stops or getting on buses and experiencing abuse. And it often will happen after, I'll give you the bus stop example. You're standing at a bus stop, young women gave evidence to us. You're standing there, somebody comes, they want to chat you up. When you express no interest in the person, then it turns nasty because there's a sort of sense of being rejected. And the vulnerability of the male psyche is to not just leave it alone, but for some people, and it's not all men who do this, obviously, and we're talking about some, but it's not, you'd hardly find a woman who hasn't had the experience. of turning nasty and saying, you know, abusive things about the fact that they wouldn't really want to be with her anyway because she's an ugly whatever. And the language is poisonous. And I do believe that some of this disinhibition that we're now seeing expressed publicly by young men actually has started because of disinhibition virtually and on social media, where there has been a sort of liberation to anonymously saying vicious things about women and towards women who dare to put their head above the parapet. And that disinhibition now is on the streets, and women experience it. Men talking in loud voices in public spaces about sexual matters in the most gross and degrading ways about women. And so what do you do about that? Who comes into your partnership? Because it was wonderful hearing Nicole talking about how you've got to invest in multilateral approaches, and you described that too, Martin. But what do you do? Where do you get the partnerships to deal with this stuff that happens at a low level and where women don't even feel there's any point in approaching the police because they think it'll be dismissed? We kept hearing about, you know, flashing. The police do nothing about women complaining about flashing. You know, cross-examine you. Did you really see the penis? You know, stuff. And so I just wonder, who are the partners in this, in creating a multilateral response, and how low do you go in terms of dealing with really horrible behaviour that is so undermining of women in the public arena, because it means that women don't want to participate in lots of things that might mean taking part in public discourse.
Thank you very much for that. You're absolutely spot on with that. It reminds me a little bit of the sort of the broken windows approach that New York police followed. If you tackle the broken windows, you'll be able to tackle more serious crime. And you made the point, if we tackle, it's not low level. I hate to use that phrase, but you know, because it's high impact. You know, somebody doing that to you at a bus stop, or it's high impact. You will never forget it. You'll live with it for a long, long time. But is it being policed? That's the question. Nicole, is there anything you want to say on that? You were nodding away.
I was. I mean, it's an excellent point. I think when I was talking earlier, I definitely had in mind domestic abuse related work in the past, but I take the point completely. And I think that the thing that we all really find, well, it's a struggle and a challenge, is it's not any one thing, is it? It's going to have to address some of the behavior that Baroness Kennedy just described. It is all about you know, education and the kind of work we do as a society. That is in schools and other places. There are, you know, one of my recent meetings with ministers at Department of Education is kind of, how is the work that is mandatory now in primary and secondary school on healthy relationships, how is that going? Are we investing the energy and resource and understanding how well that's being rolled out now? Where are the excellent practices? Can we expect to see more, again, consistency is a theme throughout this discussion. There are so many things about bystander approaches. You know, I know Welsh government has produced a really great document about prevention of violence against women and girls, and looking at different initiatives, including bystander approaches, which are the most effective, which are known. Going back to Martin's point about evidence, we have to accept that the evidence is not absolutely comprehensive and across the board, but we have to also look at what we do have, invest in what we can do to change the context. And then when we get to the policing response, obviously, I think, you know, having some of the plans set out will help. I think having some of the Safer Streets funding and the points that the women's sector have made about the need for that to be much more gender informed and learning from those initiatives and investments. But I would go back possibly to my original point, which is to say, why aren't, in the same way 20 some years ago, community safety partnerships that I was starting to be involved with were having to grapple with very, very poor practice in relation to domestic abuse? Why wouldn't we be talking about these other crimes. And I think it is probably starting to happen at the local level more and more in this year, and because of all of the context of what we've talked about. But I do think there is a rightful place within community safety partnerships, within police and crime commissioners, task forces, which is what I was hearing some PCCs talking about earlier, not just domestic abuse, but champions within there, within the police and crime commissioner's office, really highlighting and bringing these things to the fore. And so I would go back to some of those similar mechanisms to say that that's where the challenge needs to be. I think where we're going wrong often is wanting to raise the issue and then expect police to sort it out totally. And I think one of the things we've got to realize is, and I think police and Martin and others are saying, Paddy, are saying this too, we have to be talking about this in a more transparent way, with many partners involved, and having those elements of accountability front and center. And I think that is, it sounds very easy to do. It's easy to say, harder to do. I appreciate that, but I think that's where we're headed.
Thank you so much, Nicole. I'm going to come back to you in a moment, Mandu. Just want to, I remember the community safety partnerships because I was obviously on them in the early 2000s. And what struck me was firstly a real commitment, because it was something new and everybody thought great. But secondly, it was well funded. No disrespect to any government since, but we didn't have the financial crash until 2008. And government, I think, Paddy, you were part of that government, were prepared to put money into community safety partnerships and criminal justice and local authorities. And we're in a different world now, particularly post-COVID world, well, if we are post-COVID, where the reality is that funding is not available. So I don't quite know how we get to the levels of success, I guess, the CSPs were able to bring in that period. Mandu, over to you. The issue of tackling the things that you experience, at street level, I think really.
Yeah, I mean, I think the point you made earlier about multi-agency working is wonderful in theory, but it costs money. And it does cost money to bring in the sort of smaller groups that have a presence and have influence in the communities. But this is why I say forgive me, Helena, but I'm taking it back up again. This is why I say classifying this issue in the same way as terrorism and organized crime is dealt with would unlock money. The counterterrorism budget is something like 2.3 billion. And what we've been doing over the last 10 years is stripping back the budgets that are available to do all of the work we've spent the last hour and a bit talking about. And so when you reclassify something, it paves the way for coordination, for community organizing, for the kind of work that I think we're all in agreement needs to be done and needs to be part of the solution. I do think that, and this might come as a little bit of a surprise, what I'm about to say, but I do think if we're trying to change how women feel when they experience these, let's say, low-level types of crimes and then report them, we've also got to look at the health of the police workforce itself. I think something like 90% of police officers have experienced or witnessed something traumatic. 1 in 5 suffer from PTSD. So that's 5 times higher than the general population. Yet only 16% sought help, right? So that for me paints a picture of a culture, again, maybe a stoic, macho, bro culture that doesn't allow space for police to be sensitive and be compassionate and operate in ways that would actually make women feel understood, feel safe, feel respected, feel appreciated when they want to report that somebody's flashed their penis at them or somebody's harassed them in a violent, threatening way at a bus stop.
Mandu, thank you very much indeed. And that data you just outlined is actually really quite telling. I'm going to come to you in a moment, Martin. Paddy's got his hands up as well. But just on that point, Martin, when I come to you, there's a challenge put out to you about the workforce and the challenge, the issues that your workforce are facing. Paddy?
Well, Nazir, I'm pleased that you mentioned the crash and austerity. And one of the things that it caused people to do was to cut their budgets and retreat into their own silo. And that's one response. The second response, and the response that Nicole's been making throughout, is that in times of shortage, the sensible thing is to pool your budgets, to identify common problems and find a solution that works for all of us. And you also mentioned the lockdown and COVID. Again, it'd be interesting to hear Martin's views on this. But one of the things that has come out of the pandemic and the crisis is more effective partnership working. And one of the lessons I think we need to learn going forward is how to develop that and keep that going. The health sector has always been a difficult partner to work with because it's so fragmented. But the experience over the past 2 years has shown that we can and we should make progress. So, I mean, I think those are important lessons going forward.
Thank you, Paddy. Martin, before I come to you, we're going to close shortly. So can I ask everybody to think about a couple of minutes closing, and particularly around recommendations, the things that they feel that would really make a difference quickly, or it doesn't really matter, but when you can. So I'll do that in the order that I opened. So Martin, this is you can answer whatever it is that you want to say now, and I'll come back to you again with your final comments.
Can you hear me now? Yeah, excellent, thank you. Yeah, just really to answer a couple of those points. I mean, Mandu, your point about the health of our workforce is a really key point. I don't know where those figures were from. I look at lots of those sort of figures. I think, but what I would say is that sort of macho culture you described was definitely the one that was existing when I joined many years ago. I think we are in a much better place in terms of that, and certainly from my role previously, our problem was not that people weren't coming forward, it was actually providing the services for the budget we had to actually support individuals. So I think we are in a better place, and I don't think it's that particularly that ends up with the response that we don't want. That's more about demand, quite frankly. The pressure that our people are under, whether it's the responding to the call on the night, and more importantly, in this kind of arena, when you look at almost any element of violence against women and girls, the investigators will be holding more cases than they should be holding in an ideal world, which gets you back into Paddy's point really about funding. I think we've worked so much more closely through COVID with all the other bodies, and I think there is some real opportunity for us to build on that, and we've done some work. But one of those areas which really figures, and Nicole mentioned it at the very beginning when she talked about IDVAs, but you've also got ISVAs, and I just think it is a disgrace the degree to which those individuals are funded and the range of organisations that are expected to fund them, which gives you no sustainability, no coherence, and they are the people that are actually supporting those that are going through the system. And I know we've said it's not all about the system, but the ones that go through, if we can't support them collectively, then you're never going to win that trust and confidence point. So I'll stop there.
Yes. No, thank you, Martin. And what you've just said also feeds the postcode lottery. Some part of the country will have really good numbers of ISVAs and IDVAs and public resources. Others may not see it as a priority. And so as a victim or a survivor, it really depends on where I am. And that can't be right. So now, if it's okay, it's an opportunity really for everybody to be able to talk about their sort of final points. A couple of minutes each, please, including Susanna's asked me recommendations for change, or however you want to put it. Before I do that, Mandu's put in the chat the figures she cited were from a study carried out by Cambridge University in 2018. So we need to look at that at some point. So in the order that we opened, Nicole, over to you.
Great, thank you. Thank you again for having me. I think my final points might, maybe it feels a bit lazy, will echo some of my first points, which is that in listening to this conversation, I think we can all recognize where we're headed, which in a lot of ways is refreshing. I mean, with the serious violence prevention duty, with the discussions and the leadership within policing about public health approaches, we are absolutely, and this greater recognition and kind of watershed moment about violence against women and girls collectively and as a society, we are headed in this direction where we must have a more preventative approach. And I would just say the two things that we really have a shared we should have a shared commitment to is exactly what Martin just spoke about, which is we have to bed down the specialist response and support for domestic abuse, sexual violence, violence against women and girls, the experts within these charities that are always struggling to survive. We're now at a point 50 years on where we have to recognize that needs to be settled and more strategically funded to get the expertise and the progress we really want. And also we have a real shared need to invest in knowing what works in terms of prevention, looking at kind of the evidence that we have that so far, that expecting that government in our strategies and the resource that follows, they are investing in a serious endeavor to look at what prevention we should all be undertaking, what works. And so I think we could all get behind those two things, and that would unlock a huge amount of progress for where we're headed. Thanks very much.
No, thank you so much. Paddy.
Well, let me just make a point that others have made. We wouldn't have had this discussion 10 years ago or even 5 years ago. And this has really shot up the agenda. And there are moments of change. This is a moment of change. And Nicola, early on in the discussion, talked about the sparsity of money, particularly into the third sector, who provide many of these services. One of the things that we've got to be clear about, and Helena was making the point around bus stops, is that this is a responsibility of all of us. Here in Nottinghamshire, the city transport are involved in the campaign, the Net's involved in the campaign. We need to involve colleges and schools in the campaign. And look, let's get on. Somebody said we've had enough of reports. Sure, we've had enough of reports. There's a lot of good practice about let's get hold of it, let's promote it, and let's get on and do it.
Thank you, Paddy. Mandu.
An important principle, I think, to guide any implementation of solutions in this space is, I think we need more specialist rather than generalist approaches. Those need to be appropriately funded. IDVAs and ISVAs are an obvious category, but there is also the necessity, I think, to fund, as we've spoken about, and lobby hard for the money to sponsor this work, the partnerships between those specialist organizations and those who are sort of more traditionally in the crime prevention or crime fighting space. I think we need to demand public information, long-term type campaigns to support legislation changes. In the 70s, it was quite normal to go to the pub and drink 4 pints of beer and then drive home. And then they changed the law, but that itself didn't change people's behavior. You got to change what is normal. You've got to change what people believe is an appropriate way of conducting themselves and living in society. Again, that has to come at such a large scale that its genesis must be government. And it can't just be, we're just going to do one thing here, a little campaign on the tube this spring because we need to kind of clean up our act and calm people down. This is 10 years worth of work. Let's think long term now. I am tired of short term thinking. And last of all, as I've already said, I think I like how you framed it, Paddy. It is an opportunity right now to address and change the culture inside the police services that we've all been talking about. But it's going to take really courageous leadership. It's going to take admitting there's a problem. It's going to take improving whistleblowing approaches. It's going to take rewarding people who exhibit the kind of behavior we want to encourage, but cracking down on those who don't. Impunity is a disaster in this context. And I want to see zero tolerance for impunity of anything even remotely sexist or misogynistic.
Thank you, Mandu. Helena?
People have said wonderful things, and I too want to pick up on Paddy's saying that this is actually a conversation that could couldn't have taken place in quite this way 5 years ago with a group of people who are around the table. And it is a moment of change. And but we've had, certainly in my long life in the law, we've had other moments of change. And unfortunately, they don't develop the kind of real sea change that one was hoping for. And so how do we make that? And I do agree that we have to challenge the normalization of certain kinds of conduct. And that does mean dealing with, and we have to find ways of describing this, and there's no insult meant in it, but you know, low level, it's not ending your life having somebody flash at you. But for some people at a particular age, for girls, it can have a really deep impact of being frightening, and then leading into behavioral change from the points of view of women rather than the point of view of men. I want the focus to shift to the perpetrators and away from the women. And I like the idea of it being suggested by Martin that we talk much more about male violence rather than, you know, somehow obscuring it in this violence against women and girls as if it happened. It was Martians that were doing it. And so we really do have to deal with this, then challenge the normalization. And I have to say to you, it's difficult. Why and man, the state of our criminal justice system just now, because after all those years of austerity and drawing money out of policing, drawing money out of the courts, drawing money out of legal aid, drawing money out of the whole system, has meant that, you know, of course, police are going to say, how can we be expected to deal with serious crime and yet we're supposed to be dealing with a bus stop? You know, so all I can tell you is that the crime that's been committed here is to not think any of this was mattered. And so there is a serious issue around resourcing in order to make things better. The law has a role to play. The law basically, it is not just symbolic, it actually is, it reaches into our society telling us what is acceptable and not acceptable, and that leads to normalization of things that are just beyond the pale. So I just think that we really do have to work with our police, with everybody else in the system. We do have to have proper training programs from the very beginning, and we know. Look at the business recently of the young women police officers who were making horrible comments along with their male colleagues about women's underwear and whether women smelled and things like that. We know that women in male environments can actually adopt misogyny too. So this is learning for all of us. And so I do think that proper good training programs for offenders, for the young, for policing, for judges, for everybody is really has to be high on the agenda.
Thank you very much, Lady Helena. And finally to you, Martin.
Thank you. I won't repeat what others have said. I guess from my perspective, the really important point for me to make is this is a programme of work that is at the absolutely top of our agenda and being taken incredibly seriously. And I think that is something positively for all of us to build on. But again, as the others have said, we are particularly Mandu's point, there is no answer here that happens in 12 or 18 months. We are talking about very significant change in people's attitudes, in people's behaviours, in what is expected. And that's going to take time, and that requires a long-term view and a long-term investment, starting with government and then working through all the other agencies and organisations. That's got to be able to support and sustain those that the evidence says are doing a really good job. And then the last thing I would say is I genuinely would reframe the debate entirely into talking about male violence, because if we're genuinely going to be preventive, that's the route where you're going to prevent. And talking about VORG is almost takes some of the responsibility off them, and I think that's where we've got to be, and that's what I would advocate.
I'm really grateful to you, Martin. I think that's that's pretty much everybody said that. And similarly with me, any strategy that begins with the words "women must" or "women should" is an utter failure, and always has done. We don't see one that says men must and men should, but that's where we need to be, quite frankly. And I think that's a really important point that's been made by everybody. I think we've gone everywhere I would love to have gone, and I'm really grateful to my panel, to Nicole, to Paddy, to Mandu, to Baroness Helena Kennedy, and to Martin Hewitt for their inspiring, motivating, and very informative conversation. And reinforce what's been said by everybody else. A year ago, we wouldn't have had this panel. The number of times I've sat in a room talking about violence against women and girls, Nicole will know this, and Mandu will know this, whereas 98% of women in the room. The only men are probably, walking through because they want to go somewhere else. It literally is that. Unless we focus on what men can do and what men should do, this issue will be with us for generations to come. So I want to thank you all very much on behalf of Policing TV, and hopefully I'll see you in the next episode. Goodbye all.
Bye. Thank you very much.